Good afternoon. This is Jefferson Aubrey. So I'm going to present the draft, the autonomic network intent and format. And as Shing said before, this is a non-shorted item. Next slide. So as an introduction, when you have an autonomic network, this network is supposed to avoid the intervention from the human administrators. So in order to do that, it's necessary to have some kind of guidance from such administrators. And this is what the intent is for. Since we're considering a network where the autonomic functions are distributed within the network, it's necessary that the nodes can unscramble the intent and take some actions and have some kind of behavior that is considered this intent. Next slide. So from the RFC 7575, an intent is an abstract high-level policy used to operate the network. So this is basically different from the usual network configuration procedure from network management system. So one of the things that came from that is that it's not necessary when using an intent to configure each node separately. And as intent examples, and Brian presented before, one of such is the prefix management. And there are other examples. For example, you can say in an intent which kind of IGP you want to use or you should be used to given some kind of restriction in a network and or transportation layer. So there are other examples of information that can be refined from the intent. Next slide. And when we're writing the draft, we consider that there are two parts of the intent. And the first part is the common information, which is described in each intent or by every intent in the network. And there are also unspecific parts that influence the configuration of the nodes. So for this part, we use some detailed information, detailed parts, and this is what we call in the draft as content. Next slide. So using an example which is similar to one that Brian presented, in the higher part of the slide, we have the common part, which is some information that every intent in the network should have. For example, we can see the type and the domain or the version of the intent. And in the lower part of the figure, we have the content, which is the information specific to describe which is the behavior that is expected from the network. So as Brian said before, this is not a final version of the format that you are expecting to provide in the draft. So this these details may be subject to change. Next slide. So the format of the intent should be based on tags, and so we are describing some of the tags that should be presented on every intent. So the first one, which is the autonomic intent, is the root tag for the intent. Then we have the type, which is the association to a specific ASA. Then we have the autonomic domain of the intent, which is some kind of a way to describe which is the scope of the intent. Then we have two versions. The first one is the intent version, which is used for synchronization purpose. Then we have the model verse, which is the model used to describe the intent. Then we have the name of the intent for human readability. After that, two time information. The first one is the timestamp, which is the time when the intent was created. And the second one is the lifetime. So we have the lifetime for the intent. And one special case for that is a permanent intent. And then we have the signature, which is mechanisms to provide some security properties such as authentication, integrity, and non-repudiation. Next slide. So, and going to the specific part, we have the content, which contains the main information of the intent. And this information can be objects, policies, goals, configuration data, and other information. So the detail contents and formats should be defined under specific situations. So we expect that this is described in other documents. So we're mostly defining the common part of the intent in this document. And we're also considering that may in a network have some kind of sub-intents or a hierarchical version of the intent. Next slide. So there are some open issues on the draft right now, and I think it's important to say that this draft in the first version, the second version, so it's kind of initial work. And the first one is that when you are considering self-management, we can talk about that for the infrastructure or for the service. So, for example, we can have an intent that is described for the entire network or intents that can be described for specific services that are running on that network. So the question is, and for example, if you have an intent which is for a specific service, the lifetime of this intent can be different, for example, for a service that will run for a specific time than for the entire operation of the network. So when we're saying this, it's the same to say that we can have only one administrative intent for the network and some different specific intents for a specific service. Next slide. So the question is, when we say that, we can talk that maybe we should organize intents into separate administrative and service intents. So this is something, in other words, we're saying that there are different types of intents, and these are intrinsically different because they are aimed at different objectives. Another option for that is just saying that there are different intents in the network, and some of the intents are refined by specific ASAs in the network. So there are intents, and when the ASA recognizes the intent type of a specific intent, it will use that intent in order to configure itself and so forth. Next slide. And the second open issue right now for us is that when we're discussing the definition of a common part and a specific part of intent, we also came to the conclusion that maybe it's necessary to have a hierarchical version, as I said before, of the intent. So we can say that maybe in a network we have a higher level intent and then a lower level sub-intents, or we can have just how can I say that, different intents that are not observing any hierarchical form. Next slide. I think that's it. I don't know if someone has asked questions.
Just a moment. Before taking the question, there is a clarification with my chair hat on. Is currently we don't have the intent as a chartered work item, but the charter text of this working group does mention intent. It says the autonomic network will take the intent and try to translate into the detailed operations that the autonomic nodes could perform it. So for that, the autonomic network does need some kind of form intent, but until we get rechartered, we will focus on what we have the chartered work item. So that means, meanwhile, if the IETF forms other working group to work on the concepts and format, it could be. Then for next charter period, we may just take whatever the other working group, defined. We will obviously evaluate by ourselves whether that's, usable for autonomic network, or we have to define another form or another version of autonomic network intent. But if, by the time of recharter, we still don't have any working group to work out some concepts and formats, we could reuse them. I guess, by that time we may have to do that by ourselves. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah, maybe also just from a working group chair side, I think what is interesting about intent, of course, is to see what is it that we should expect to have as dependencies, probably especially against GRASP, to support intent, right? Because, yeah, obviously we will do our best to make GRASP extensible so that, obviously, even if we don't do it first round, we should be easy to add. But, I think right now our understanding is most likely that, if we could just flood some file that happens to have intent, maybe that's good enough. So something around those lines, that seems to be a very good basis. And I'm sure Brian is going to add a little bit more. The other, before you go on, the other part that I think makes sense is exactly trying to figure out what is the other stuff going in the IETF that already is going to set the stage for us, right? So I mean, Sheng was just saying a working group, but I'm not aware of anything specific for intent. But what is there?
Super, maybe.
Okay. Oh, okay, cool. But I think the other thing, of course, is there have been Yang data models to describe network-wide semantics. So, and that obviously is also setting a stage towards that. And so I think it would be cool if, somebody would keep track of what's going on in that intent-related land. And then I think we can take it one step at a time.
Yeah. No, thanks.
Yeah, Brian Carpenter. The only thing I wanted to say, I think this is very interesting. I think it's very useful to have this ticking along in the background so that during our other work we have some idea of what we might have to deal with. The one thing that I hope is obvious to everybody is that in some intent objects will be quite large objects. So any hope of fitting all messages into 1500 bytes is dead as soon as you start talking about intent. So that's something we must not forget.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think for Mike.
Yeah, Dan Romashkanu, co-chair of what was SuperBOF. What kind of bothers me is that I'm not sure that when saying intent, we mean exactly the same thing. So John Strassner here on my right sent a mail, or actually more than one, kind of trying to put in perspective the differences between the approaches in your draft and in what is actually not even specifically called intent, but people have mapped it to intent in SUPA. And this is probably something that we might need to clarify from a terminology point of view, because probably one of the most disturbing or detracting things is actually to call different things or slightly different things with the same name.
Can I maybe, if you folks had that BOF and have opinions about what you call intent, could you just for the next IETF ask for a slot and just give a summary of that? I think that might be a good thing, right?
Sure. Yeah, one thing, obviously for us as ANIMA working group, what we would interest even in the future is the version of intent which would be applied into autonomic networks. So I know there may be some generic intent format, but that should probably outside of out scope of this working group. In any case, go ahead.
John Strassner, Huawei. So there's a draft in SUPA, which is of course still a BOF, it's not a working group, that Maxim Plias from Netcracker and I served as editors for. And it gives a quick comparison of different intent efforts in not only in other SDOs, but open source consortia. And if I summarize that very quickly, since this is a non-chair item, a non-chartered item, it's also a non-chair item, I guess. The main difference is the amount of specificity that is conveyed with intent. Okay, so on the one hand, you've got people that think that intent should be very abstract. So you wouldn't have things like a prefix or a port number or a protocol specified because the system should be able to figure that out. On the other hand, you've got people that violently disagree with that and say that all of those things are possible. SUPA is probably somewhere in the middle. SUPA uses formal logic. So we use propositional logic as well as first order logic. OpenStack Congress is between those, that's data log. So it's not quite first order logic. And let me just stop there. But I can send it. Yeah.
Cut 9 after you.
Thanks, John. I have fairly strong views on what we want to do with intent. And I do personally not think we want to go down the track of just what you said, John, defining parameters and stuff like that. So I'm completely with you on that. I would like to see in what we do in ANIMA, what others do with something that they may call the same thing, naming under discussion. Mm-hmm. I don't mind. But in ANIMA, I would like a statement that says everything that a function can figure out without intent, it shall figure out. Right? Because I think there is, if we have that as a guiding principle, that actually reduces what you have to put in intent already dramatically. There's not that much actually that you really have to provide as policy.
Thanks.
Yeah, Charles, like a just individual contributor, right? I mean, to make life easy, it's all the fault of the ASA, right? So if intent has too many parameters, it is intent for a bad ASA. Right?
And I would argue
you cut the line.
There's another question. Oh yeah, sorry. I'm still talking. There is another question on whether we should actually make intent ASA specific. It's a possibility.
Yeah.
It certainly makes processing easier.
Of course.
But it will make conflicts more likely, in my opinion, because you send one to this and one to the other. To be thought of. I have no strong view on that.
And I think that it can make the intent very aimed at a specific nodes. I think this is something that we should avoid.
No, RFC plus 7575 even says it should not address.
Yeah, because of that, it should directly.
We're running late, so thanks, Jason. I do encourage you to discuss that in Marinist, and even that's not charter work item yet, but obviously, as working group, we do care. We do show interest in for autonomic network intent. Yeah.
No, in fact, I think that there are some discussions about some topics of the draft, but they are not pointing directly to the draft. So maybe we can, we can have that on future versions.
Sure. Okay. So who's next? Me? Could you make it quicker?